Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
Well, a returning guest, but one always welcome, not least of which because he's one of the few people in the world who will put up with my inane questions as this world of ecological dynamics hits me left, right, and centre, and I find myself asking myself many questions. Rob Gray's back. Rob, welcome.
Thank you, Stuart. My pleasure.
Fellow podcaster, obviously, and if people out there are not aware of your podcast, which I highly doubt, but if they're not, your podcast, which I see as the brainy version of the brainy brother or sister of this podcast, the Perception Action podcast, highly recommended. It definitely accompanies many of my journeys. The only thing about your podcast, Rob, I have to say, is it's usually packed so full of things that I want to write them down, and I rarely get the chance to be able to listen to a podcast where I can write stuff down. I'm usually in the car. And then the other thing about it I found as well, and I don't know whether anybody else has ever said this either, is that I'm listening to your podcast, and then what happens is I find myself, my brain goes somewhere else completely. And I have these amazing revelations, right? And I think, oh, that's brilliant. I can do that. And about 10 minutes of podcast has gone by, and I'm like, oh, what's he just said for the last 10 minutes? And I have to rewind back and kind of start again because I've had this brilliant revelation. Has anyone else ever said that to you?
I think so, in similar ways. Yeah, people have said, there's a lot in it, and sometimes it does inspire. I guess that's a good thing. I do the same thing with some of the things I listen to. You kind of go off on the brain, and so yeah, definitely. I've had quite a few people ask me for transcripts. So yeah. One of the things I did to try to help. I think you do this as well, but did a Patreon site for that to try to. So I do make those available for anyone that's interested. There's a little plug. Yeah. But yeah, no, I have had that kind of. I try not to. Well, it's hard not to pack it a lot in there when you're talking about research studies and theory and stuff. So
yeah,
I try not to do too much.
Well, yeah, I mean, what you are doing is, I think, is a really good kind of summary of a particular, quite dense topics often. But I think because it's a summary, usually it's the golden nuggets, and those nuggets are like, yeah, wow, that's great. Oh no, here comes another one. Oh, here comes another one. So that's definitely been.
I appreciate it. Yeah, I agree. Our podcasts fit well together.
Yeah, I'm trying to apply some of these ideas. It's interesting though how often one of your podcasts comes along, and it's either something that I've been thinking about. Right, so there's an interesting idea. I need to do that. And then next thing, your podcast comes along, and there's a great bit of research that basically supports that idea. or I experience something through my coaching world that kind of challenges me a little bit, and then I find myself thinking, right, there's got to be an answer to that. And then lo and behold, here comes another piece of research or a subject area or whatever it might be. And and it's uncanny. I don't know whether it's like the availability heuristic or something, but it's kind of uncanny the way that happens. It happens too often.
Yeah, maybe there's some logic to that, because I think I try, like when I see discussions on Twitter and stuff so I try when I see something come up that I think could use a little clarification, or maybe, or sometimes it makes me wonder. Hey, I wonder, like, lately I've been trying to like some of the terminology and dig a little bit deeper into, So one I want to do fairly soon. Everybody talks about intrinsic dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing on my list, I want to, what the heck exactly is that? What do we mean by that? And things like that. So I do I get a lot of ideas from kind of discussions online people have, and things people don't quite, I think could, use a little more depth to them. Maybe not understanding. Yeah.
Yeah, actually. So maybe that's what it is. Maybe I'm having these conversations on Twitter and it's like a Google thing. Like, the next thing there's like, here it comes. Oh, here's the answer.
So I do try to do that a little bit when I see something, or if I see something I think people have a misunderstanding about, which happens a lot sometimes, but not that I understand it. So a lot of this I'm learning as I go too. And sometimes sometimes they come out better structured than I dive into the thing and I find a nice structure, and sometimes not. It just wanders. Like, I better end this somewhere. Yeah.
It's one of the interesting dynamics, I think, of actually working in this space, because I genuinely feel that, well, I feel like that the sort of the ecological psychology or the ecological dynamics community are really, really interested in the questions that practitioners are posing, and genuinely almost it feels like the practice is leading the research, because as practitioners are sort of delving into this in more detail, they're discovering things they can't find quite answers for. So they're asking the researchers to say, listen, tell me more about this experience I'm having, or what can I do about this problem I've got? And the researchers seem only too willing to either go, oh yeah, no, we've got something on that, here it is, or go, that's interesting, let's see what the literature says. And if the literature doesn't say anything, well, there we go, then we're off into the experimental space. Definitely feels like that to me. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's one of the better areas for that. Obviously I'm biased, but
sure.
I think it's, it definitely has a goal of, the word ecological, we want to be in the real world and applied, and so not just staying in the lab and answering the next incremental question about that builds on one study. Not that there's there's not a function or a role for that, but yeah, I tend to think so too. I think people in this area tend to want to be out there and with coaches, especially more recently. Maybe when the areas first started, it was a bit more very theoretical and in the lab, but I think it is. It's and I think it's still a growing area, and I think ideas. Everyone wants ideas about what constraints, manipulations actually have people had some success with, because it's just this kind of theoretical idea. So I think that definitely is happening. I for myself, for sure.
Well, one of the things I really wanted to talk to you about was I ended up having I've been getting dragged into Twitter debates far too much of late. So I definitely made a bit of a kind of pact with myself to kind of pick and choose my conversations, because some of them seem to sort of descend into areas that I don't want to go into. But one was with an academic, Scandinavian based. I'm not exactly sure where. Yes, I do know Groningen, Per Rylander, and one of the things he posed, and I have to say, it stimulated quite an interesting conversation. And I've got to be honest with you, challenged me a little bit, because I kind of thought, he makes an interesting point. It's a point that's been made before, but basically the gist of the argument, and I'll dig it out in a minute if we need it, was that whilst some of the theoretical underpinnings of the ecological approach, he said, kind of seem radical. I don't know whether that means they are or they just seem it, but anyway, the actual applications, and he listed 4 applications or 4 methods that are utilized, which I have a problem with a couple of them, but essentially the use of constraints to manipulate to manipulate changes in the athlete, the idea of information being a guidance, guiding in some of the actions. The use of drills was an odd one. Isolated practice forms. That was the third one, and then there was another that escapes my memory, but it'll come back to me in a minute. And he basically said that because they've been around a lot for a long time, that the ecological approach was actually old wine in new bottles, which was the challenge that he posed. Now, needless to say, that was red rag to a bull to me, and I charged in horns first. But I didn't necessarily immediately, but I was a little bit kind of. It challenged me a little bit because, to be fair, I mean, the argument is kind of fair enough. That some of those methods have been around for a long time. It's not like they're new. But for me, it was there's something fundamentally different in terms of the way the ecological approach utilizes those methods. They're very different. So my response was to say, you might think that on the surface, but actually when you look at the underlying rationale or the way that the how of the use of these approaches, they're radically different. He then asked me to expand on that, and I began an extended thread that I've never quite got to the bottom of, because it just kept going and going and going, and I ran out of time. I just couldn't keep committing to it, but it's there in drafts, ready to go. And part of this conversation, I'm hoping, might just put it to the end. So anyway, I'm just wanting to get your thoughts on that, really, as an opener to the conversation.
So I've had a similar attitude towards Twitter debates. I've been getting a little frustrated, and I think I've gone beyond you, and I'm gonna ignore them altogether now, because I find some not necessarily like the person you mentioned, but a lot of other people I think are being deliberately obtuse about things.
Definitely,
just to get people going, like constantly saying self-organization just means you stand and watch the players and don't do anything and let them do whatever they want. I don't know how many times I could say that that's not it, but people keep wanting to say that. Okay. Obviously I disagree. Well, on the one hand, so I would say I disagree with that old wine in new bottles concept, except for the fact that, I think we've talked about this before. There are a fair number of people that are just applying they hear the concept constraints, they run off. Oh, that just means I change the field size. They're doing unprincipled atheoretical manipulations, which is not what ecological dynamics is at all, right? So I think and Keith and Ian Renshaw talk about this in their latest book about how people seem to be just misapplying the ideas in some cases, so if you do that, then it probably is old wine in new bottles. But I think a really good example of this is small-sided games, like in football or basketball or whatever. Yes, like people have been doing that for a long time, right? That's not a new idea, the actual manipulation itself. But you look at the work that's being done to understand why it works. The affordances there, the interpersonal spacing, the information. To me, that hasn't been around, right? That's new stuff. And from understanding why that works and what's going on there, then we can come up with new ways to do that, So maybe some of the core things, like obviously manipulating constraints, but manipulating constraints, like I think that there's a good example right there. The word constraints has a really meaning, right? It's Carl Newell. It has a really deep meaning to it. It's not just the field size, so you can manipulate constraints and manipulate constraints. One of them has been around a long time. The other, I don't think is being, you know what I mean? It's not the actual understanding the task, understanding the information, understanding the affordances, and the manipulating those. I think it hasn't been around as long. If that makes any sense.
So. Let me just check if I understand what you're saying there. I think where people fundamentally get it wrong is they think that a lot of people constrain to constrain, and within an ecological approach, you're constraining to afford.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's the bit that I don't think people fully realize. And I actually do think there's a lot of people out there thinking that they're using a constraints-led approach. I actually think some governing bodies have adopted a constraints-led approach and promoted a constraints-led approach, but it's actually it's just throwing constraints at something. Oh yeah, like you say, you use acronyms like change it or step, and step is space, task, equipment, people. Now that's a really good aid memoir to think of the ways in which you could manipulate an environment. Change the space, change the tasks, change the number of people or what the people can do, change the equipment that you can use. They're broadly the constraints, but it's the application of those constraints that's the important thing. And if you're constraining in order to define the information that's available or to throw light on certain information sources and sort of dim other information sources, then you're constraining to afford. And that's what we're talking about. Whereas other people, I think, are just thinking, if I make the space smaller, that will mean it's harder for the people to be able to perform the action, and therefore then we'll get the outcome that we're looking for. And they're often surprised when they can't see that, so then they defer to instruction because they're not seeing the behavior they're looking for.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely a good point. I think, it's so maybe some of the manipulations aren't new, but a lot of cases, you're right. People in the past and they're using them to guide people to the one solution they want them to have, right? The technique versus using constraints and probably, the constraints probably wasn't the best choice of name for it. You're right. It's not, but using constraints to aid self-organization. And like, that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to constrain people, force them so they have to pass this way or have to do it this way. We're trying to use it to facilitate self-organization. I think that's a fundamental difference. That's not old wine, right? I think that's a big difference. I think those, to me, I think that's the big difference. And understanding like I said, the information people are using, doing more of a task analysis, and I think that to me that's not something people are doing. I don't know how it's being applied, I guess, as well as other people, because I'm more of the theoretical side. But from what I see, it's much different, right? In my sport, like in baseball, people have been doing stuff with changing bat weights and stuff now for a long time. So if you just look at, giving a batter different weights and stuff, that's old wine. But doing it to enhance practice variability, to get people to explore more, so they change, and having a principled thing you're trying to change, that's not old to me. that's a new, fairly new. And so I don't agree with that assessment either. Yeah.
So, I mean, I was talking recently with Andrew Wilson. We were at a symposium organised by Keith, and he used the term skilled intentionality, and he was referring to athletes and their engagement with an environment, and essentially it's them essentially gearing their actions towards a particular outcome, let's say, or a particular goal, or a puzzle, solving a problem, or whatever it might be. And it's the process of discovering and exploring the different solution possibilities or movement possibilities that enable them to do so. And this concept of skilled intentionality. Now, I apply that concept to coaching as well. Coaches need to have skilled intentionality. There's two components to that. Firstly, you have to be clear on intent. And this is something that, and it goes back to your point around task analysis, you have to have a really good understanding of the task that the athletes are trying to explore. So that means you have to understand in dynamic team sports, you have to understand principles of play. You have to understand then what the various movement possibilities that are within the principles of play, and then you have to do very, very skilled practice design to design an environment that is going to enable is to get just the right amount of information present in that environment that the athletes are able to explore, because you don't always want them to be overloaded with myriad possibility. You've said before, it's not an all-you-can-eat buffet. So it's not just playing a game and all bets are off. It's actually saying what we're going to do is we're going to eat from this part of the buffet for a little while. You've still got loads of choice, but it's just in this space for a little while. I really like that analogy. So that skilled intentionality for a coach, I mean, I think that's just fundamental anyway. But one of the things I think people have sort of misunderstood is how important practice design becomes when you're looking to try and consider this way of working. You have to be very on point with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And, a lot of times when I work with teams and coaches now, it seems like half the time what I'm doing is just asking why. Why are you doing that activity? What's the goal? What are you trying to achieve? And a lot of times, like I'm sure the people haven't thought through exactly why. Well, we're practicing fielding. Well, what about fielding? Do you want someone to really get better at this, or you just want them to feel confident, or So I think I agree. You have to have intent and a goal for practice activities, and then that shapes the design of what you're trying to achieve. And not everything's supposed to be about this radical learning exploration, right? You can't do that all the time. You need some time where people are going to have things are going to be easy and they're going to perform well and make them feel confident about what they're doing. And but you do I think you need to have a plan, though. You need to know what the goal of each one is. Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the key things to that is your point about you can't do the exploration stuff all the time is proximity to performance. The closer you are to performance, the less you're going to want somebody to be going in a purely exploratory, loads of failure type scenario. You want somebody to then be almost refining. And that's why somebody tried to bait me the other day on Twitter. Neil McCarthy, he's a good friend, but he's a truly evil man. And he put this video of the England rugby team preparing for one of their matches. And they had one of the coaches stood on a step ladder. And one of the hookers was throwing the ball to an area and the coach is catching the ball on this stepladder. It was completely stable, right? So there was no change of height by the coach. So the hooker was just continuously throwing to a static target. Right. Now, if you look at that, you're thinking, well, that's got nothing like the kind of representativeness that the game is going to present to them. And why aren't you practicing throwing to people? Well, that wasn't the goal. The goal was we're very close to proximity. This hooker just wants to get used to the idea of putting the ball in a certain spot. And they're going to do a bit of repetition. It's not designed for them to be. It's not designed around a technical thing. A skill development type idea. It's purely about some kind of technical repetition just to get them comfortable in quite close proximity to competition. Because you don't want a lot of failure in that scenario, because that could actually be potentially damaging from a confidence perspective. So in that scenario, it's a perfectly applicable thing to do. But my problem is people are doing that kind of thing in a space that's quite away from competition, where we should be learning about stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Carl Newell talks about this, searching through perceptual motor space. He talks about the exploration exploitation dilemma, trying to get this balance of searching to find a new, potentially an even better coordination solution or movement pattern versus getting the one that you have better. I think another way to think of that too is in terms of that we underestimate the importance of calibration, perceptual motor calibration. I'm going to talk about this in a few. I read a really interesting paper on darts where they showed that the first throw in the series of 3 darts is always less, even in top professional players, is always less accurate than the other two.
Right.
Just a little bit of time between you throwing your 3, going to grab, wait for the other person to throw. Like that's hardly any time. That's seconds. That's enough to kind of your calibration of your perceptual motor system. It gets a little bit right. You have to recalibrate. It's not looking for a new solution, but so I think we need to do that as well. And then like you said, there is a confidence factor. Being able to throw the ball to generally the right area that people are going to be jumping to grab it. I think is important for players. So close to a competition, you're right. I think you want to focus on that. So, yeah, I agree with you. There's times for those things, definitely.
And I think again, a lot of that depends on kind of what the task that's been provided to the performer is. So, for example, if the task for the performer was purely about kind of deliver the ball roughly to the same spot for X number of trials, and just be aware or place your awareness of how the ball feels as it releases your hands, right? So you're still keeping an external focus of attention, albeit very proximal. Or it might just be, can you keep your focus, can you create an imaginary hole in the air that you're going to aim to hit through, and how close to that were you? And we'll give, and we'll do some comparable feedback. So, I would be asking the athlete in that scenario to feedback to me what they're experiencing, either from the ball release perspective or whether they hit their imaginary hole, or does their imaginary hole need to be higher or lower, and then maybe concurring with the athlete in terms of where they were. Now, that's still very rich and deep in learning from a relatively basic task. And so you can't always infer everything from the task's representativeness as to whether there is deep learning going on in that scenario. Now, I have to say, I would be tempted to just add a little bit more variability just to be able to see if they can make the adjustments. But that might be the next stage on. I've just seen a snapshot of a piece of video, which is why it wasn't worth commenting on.
Right. They can move the ladder on the next. No, I agree. You're right. It is, and I try not to do that. Get these gut knee reactions when you see some of the really strange drills people do. You're right. Maybe it's just a part of it. There's something coming after. So, but I agree. You're right. You can't just and you're right. It depends on the level of athlete, when and stuff. If you, what are you trying to achieve?
Now, the other interesting thing for me, and this goes back to the conversation that I was having with Per Rylander, and I think it's a common misconception. I know we've discussed this before, but I think it's still worth exploring, is this idea that cognition doesn't play a role. Now, my belief on this, my understanding of this is, there is cognition, it's just not what you think it is. But I might be oversimplifying that, and I'd just be interested to get your take.
Yeah, I think that's the way I would describe it as well. No one is trying to argue that you're mindless robot out there playing, it's just, to me, it's when the cognition is involved. Cognition is involved, in the strategy and the intention, what's my goal, to me before, and then after, on reflection, did I achieve my goal? But I think the thing that we kind of don't agree with, trying to argue again, is the role of cognition during, in terms of the actual skill execution, the actual, the idea that you have to have awareness of the distance, and to at the lowest level during, in terms of strategy and things like that. But I think. The idea that you have some internal model where you're weighting the different options and some of those things, I think that's the kind of cognition that doesn't really fit with the ecological approach, right? For the actual, at the control of the action itself. But I think at the other stages, there's definitely a role for So I think there's also something we don't really think about is how the athlete interprets the constraints. How they're, what they think you're trying to get, so I think that's also a cognitive kind of effect too.
So no, that's interesting, because that's definitely something that I've been thinking about a little bit as well, is how we, particularly in a kind of dynamic team sport context, how we can cater for athletes who perceive the environment differently. And I'm finding that's been kind of quite interesting to me, and a source of constant kind of surprise, that even a task, how an athlete will perceive a task in a certain way different to my
Mm-hmm.
my perception of the task, and in many ways that's useful to me in the sense of it's illustrative of the fact that they've perceived the task differently from me, and often they're children, so why wouldn't that be the case?
Yeah.
But it's quite interesting how that's one of the reasons for me why it's so important to design the task without necessarily having a desired outcome, movement outcome, for example, or in mind. It's more to say there's an environment that's designed to explore an aspect, and we're leaving on the table the possibilities of what can be done within that space, because that's dependent on how the athletes are perceiving the environment.
Yeah, no, I think I like that idea. I think doing things in terms of the function rather, you're right, then a great example, the classic dribbling through cones, right? I don't know about you, but if I had to get to the other end of the field and someone laid a line of cones in front of me, I'd just run in a straight line past them, wouldn't you? Right? Why would you go around them? There's no, right? If you look in terms of function, there's no reason you need to go in and out. No one would if you gave a kid the choice to get to the other end and score. Why would they choose that movement solution? You're forcing it on them.
Yeah.
With this fake agility kind of drill. So, so I definitely think we have to think about, trying to focus on the function you want, the goal of it, rather than a specific solution to. I agree. And some people interpret things differently in terms of those things.
And so the one of the challenges with that, though, is if you this is something I found quite interesting. It's like quite a cultural challenge, I think, that people have, which is that people associate coaching with, and it goes right back to the origins of the word. You take somebody from A to B, and so and derived from the idea of a coach that would transport somebody from somewhere to somewhere. Now, a lot of people in that conceptualization, and this is it's been endemic within coach education, certainly in this country for several decades, is you need to be really clear on B, and you need to, and you work toward, and you have a very sort of systematic and planned approach of activities that will get you to B. Right. Now, reality is, very rarely do those activities actually even relate to B, but that's the idea. Yeah. So, and the success of the session is derived from whether we arrived, or how close we got to B, or whether we arrived at B.
Right.
Now, in the ecological conceptualization, there isn't really a B necessarily. So it's almost like getting on a train where there's lots of different places we could end up at, lots of different parts, or we could end up halfway along the track to a destination, or we could go off and veer off and end up in a slightly different destination, or whatever it is. But that's quite learner-led based on the way they're perceiving the environment. And that's quite difficult for people to get their heads around. Now, that doesn't mean we don't make the train as good a train as it can be, and as good at transporting as it can be. I'm torturing this analogy now. It's probably not going to work anymore. But the idea is that, we're not necessarily saying there's an end point and it looks like this. What we're saying is there's going to be an end point, and what it looks like is kind of up to you guys, or girls, or group, or individual. Now, am I taking that too far? Is that not quite right?
I think, I understand what you're saying. The role of the coach, traditionally is, I know the answer.
Yeah.
I'm going to give it to you. And I think athletes are used to being raised. I have encountered that. Athletes, when you try to do this approach, just tell me what you want me to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I know.
Yeah. You know what you want. And so I totally understand that. But I still think, within that, I like to think of, within movement, a particular skill, there's variance and invariance, right? Okay. There's some properties that are going to be common to successful movements. Like the one that I like to, if you look at Bernstein's famous hammer picture, right?
Yeah.
Blacksmith picture, the blacksmith is not swinging underhand on one go or the way up, right? There's a invariance. There's some common thing to each time he swings the hammer, or bandwidth. Sometimes I use, and the same is like to be able to throw a pitch in baseball at a high velocity. There's some things you have to have, right? There's some invariant features, but so I think that the coach's more job is to make sure the train is going to the right general. Those invariant features are present. But I think what ecological dynamics has changed people's view about, hopefully, is that the variance part is not just random. It's incredibly important to allow for that and let the athlete explore that, because that's where a lot of the real skill is. The variability from functional variability from within a skill and trial to trial. So yeah, I think that's to me that's what coaches still have a role to okay, this movement is going way off the tracks. If you want to do the train, they have to have this property, or it's not. I know it's not going to work. It doesn't mean that they have to do it exactly this way, but they need to get to this point in the movement. So that's the way that I kind of think about it. But I too solely sympathize with you changing people's view about the role of the coach. I think depending on the sport, the thing that's also seems to be helping is kind of with technology, we can give athletes way more feedback about their knowledge of their performance, right? How hard you're hitting the ball, what angle, how fast you're moving. And so give people a lot more. Because I think a lot of the reasons people stand around and ask the coach, like if it doesn't work out, the end result doesn't work out, they want to know why. And it's hard to tell why. So they rely on the coach, tell me what I did wrong, or what I need to do differently. It's hard to perceive that for yourself, especially, a lot of people don't have the awareness, to recognize why things didn't work. So I think technology can help in that way as well.
Yeah. But also, I think technology as a source of feedback after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
But what often is missing is what the coach can do to draw attention to a particular area, either through a well-designed task,
mm-hmm.
A manipulation of equipment, like you say, a manipulation of space or whatever it is, but then how that can, or just simply through a question or even a task instruction that says, mm-hmm. I'd just like you to place your attention here, mm-hmm. and report back to me what you sense. And so, and then the technology then becomes it can either confirm or deny the perception that the athlete has, what they've sensed, what they think they've sensed anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I moved like this. Well, let's have a look. Interesting. You did or you didn't, And if you haven't got the technology, then it usually is the coach's perception that says, well, your perception concurs with mine, or your perception is different from mine. And this is one of the ways that I've tried to become more sophisticated with my feedback, is, feedback being something that the athlete gives to me, mm-hmm. and as opposed to not something I give them. I only give them once they've provided me with the information once they've provided me with their recall, if you like.
Right.
And I think that those two things packaged together are very powerful.
Yeah, I agree. And so don't let your kind of view bias their feedback. And I agree. And that's another kind of misconception. There's no role for instruction. Like, instruction is totally useful within, you're right, during a task too. It's not just before, ecological approach is kind of guiding people, look over to this possible coordination solution space, right? But again, it's not, here's exactly how I want you to do it. It's like, what about passing over there, or passing the ball back at this point, or, just kind of try to make people aware, or, their attention to different possibilities. I agree. I think that is a great combination.
Or helping them almost to, helping them to look in a place where the information might be found.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Because there's too much around, and they can't, I just can't make sense of it all. And I totally get that. It's information overload.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, what about if you explore in this space? And so sometimes like a cleverly crafted question, mm-hmm. often is, what is it about this game that you're playing right now, or this task that you're performing? What is it about this that provides you with an opportunity to move past that player, for example?
Right. Yeah.
What can you do with a ball? How can you move your body? How can you move the ball? Whatever it might be, So it's kind of a clue-giving thing.
Mm-hmm.
But interestingly, even with that, even with the use of instruction, for me, the use of instruction to guide the task or to clarify the task, as it is different from a traditional approach, and this was part of that conversation I was having with Per, which was the traditional approach would be, the instruction would be, do this, do this, not don't do that movement, do this movement. That's the instead of saying, and I think this is fundamentally different, which is to say, so there's that thing there, right? Firstly, what other options are there? Secondly, if we can't conceive of any other options, how about exploring this one? Now that is an instruction. Well, I've posed it as a question. I think I've now become incapable of telling somebody something. I think I've got so conditioned out of it. Everything's a question.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I like that. That's a good analogy, right? It is this fundamental different. Aiming towards the one solution versus giving people finding their own best one, and I think that's a good way to think of it. Definitely. Sometimes when people hear that, I think they think that it's people need conscious awareness of the information, and you get into this kind of argument about cognition and things too again. But I agree. It's just getting people to explore and look for different places and think about what they're doing and explore different dynamics. Instruction can be very useful that way. Mm-hmm.
So when going back to your point earlier about variance and invariance, I assume you can have variance and invariance in team dynamics as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so. I think you assume that there's obviously basic structure to teams defined by like the task dynamics. In football or something, there's rules about where players can be, and so there's going to be a basic structure to team movement. And immediately I think of some of the work that like Duarte Araujo and colleagues have done about like teams breathing, expanding, and so there's some like invariant properties of good teams and seem to happen when they score. I think we probably less understand that, like maybe some of the things we think should be invariant, or if we broke that, it might be a lot of, I think more of the invariance on an individual level we know because of biomechanical constraints and things. We know if you're never going to be able to throw a ball super fast like this, or if you keep doing that way, you're going to get hurt. So there's probably more on an individual level, whereas at team level, maybe that's where some creativity can come in if we kind of abandon. But that's a good question. I don't know if we I think there was we made a start on some of those ideas, but there's a ways to go.
Yeah. I mean, it feels to me. So, for example, when I'm constraining to afford. So, for example, tomorrow night with my field hockey group, they're 13, 14-year-olds. They're now beginning. They've kind of developed a movement repertoire. They're still. It's a recreational group with that beautiful mixture of quite highly skilled performers who are looking for stretch and relative newbies who are in danger of being enormously overloaded and overpowered by the kind of better group. But I try and work with them as much as possible together, and I try and kind of keep the team dynamics roughly equal, so that they have to try and make the best use of the available human resource at their disposal. The task. So when I'm constraining to afford, the task that we're doing a particular activity. We've been doing it for the last 3 weeks at the moment, where it's about how we can win possession of the ball high up on the field in order to be able to launch rapid counterattacks. And so the the way I construct the game is I actually give the task to the team that are trying to bring the ball out from the back. So they're trying to bring it out and they're trying to get it into certain areas, and they score points by getting it into certain areas and then moving across to the side of the pitch. Mm-hmm. And the other team essentially have to try and stop that and launch counterattacks. So that's the nature of the game. But in order to get the team to try and the team that's essentially defending and trying to win the ball high up the field to self-organize in order to create in order to try and win the ball as much as possible, I have to then give the team that are in possession of the ball, trying to bring it out from the back, I have to give them the task. So they, if you like, are the ones who are trying to score the goals. Now, traditionally, you do it the other way around. So all the points would be for trying to get the counter-attack score. Win the ball, counter-attack score, get points. And the poor team trying to get it out didn't really get much to do with it. It was just, you get it there, get it there. So I flipped it on its head and said, right, getting it out is the cool thing. That's the way you score your points. That's the place to be. The other team, you've got to work really hard to try and win possession of the ball and then try and launch these counter-attacks super fast within 5-6 seconds, whatever it might be. So that's their task. So for me, they're the ones who, and in order to make it so what I'm slowly seeing to happen in self-organization, and you have to be really rigorous in your observation, and you have to also understand that this will not happen within one session, and resist the temptation to guide it, or to not guide it. Sorry, resist the temptation to say, right, you guys need to flood that area. Because that's the easy thing to do, isn't it? Just go, guys, get loads of bodies in there, and then they won't be able to score in that, and you can get your counterattacks. They're not doing that, right? But going back to Arroyo's point, the flock is beginning to tighten up slowly as they keep losing this game.
Right. So they're getting some structure. Yeah.
But designing
that's really interesting. I think you're right. You have to give it time, and the team question is really interesting to me. Because invariance or structure, of course, is something that the other side can exploit. Right?
Yes.
If you're too structured, you're too predictable in what you're going to be doing and things like that. So I think that is a really interesting question. And but there is some structure in terms of spacing, like the example is flocks, birds flying, always keeping their spacing. There's structure to the way they move without having some overall guiding principle to it. So. I think that's interesting. I do like the goal. I think I agree with the goal of moving the ball out. Sometimes in the drills, I don't think practice activities we don't think of the goal. I think we undersell it. Like, you're just supposed to get it across the field. If you do, then that you've done your. It's not very exciting for the team, and I think they might lead them to do it in a different way. Like then, if you actually said you've got to get it out from your end into preparation to score at the other end, I think you might get a different result than it's just to clear the ball. Yeah,
exactly. Because I see so many practice activities that are almost like they're one directional in reality. So you see an attacking group attacking, the defending group trying to stop them from scoring. If the defending group gain possession of the ball, then the practice stops and then we reset.
Yeah.
And for me, that's got. And then, interestingly, I think those same coaches get really frustrated that their defenders their attackers don't track back when they lose possession. Well, surprise, they've never done it before.
Yeah, and then same, and then you have the kids running on defense all over, covering much of area, and they get the ball, can't do anything with it. So I agree. You have to think about those things as well. Yeah.
Going back to that principle of invariance or variance. So for me, at the moment, what I see in terms of the spacing of the flock, if you like, to use that flocking analogy, there's a lot of invariance against an optimal scenario. They'll probably discover an optimal spacing scenario because, like you say, if they all flocked to, say, one side of the field where they place the ball, then that team could quite quickly and easily spring it and go to the other side, and then all of a sudden there's just literally no defenders over there, so they could potentially use that to their advantage if they're clever. So there's kind of an optimal spacing, and they probably need to now explore the difference. So one thing I might experiment with tomorrow is giving them a task whereby they kind of all have to flock to one space. And they might deliberately find that they're getting kind of countered. or they're getting broken. In which point we can say, well, okay, so what's different now between where you were too spaced apart with where you are now? Too spaced apart to too dense. So there's kind of an optimal spacing that you found you have to find for yourselves. I might have to give them. You did a podcast about that, didn't you? How you use extremes to help people find the middle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think that's a good idea. And also, maybe doing something like, time. You have to get the ball within this super short time. Yeah. Like you can't sit back and wait for the other team to make a mistake. So maybe trying to encourage the same kind of over flooding by the constraints of the task, right?
Okay.
Instead of but I think I do like that, getting the feel for the space, what happens if we do this. I think so. I think sometimes it's hard to know, like it's almost like hard to know why things work, athletes to know why things worked and didn't work, so getting to experience from different angle, in the perceptual motor workspace, we talk about coming in from different directions, different start points. I think, what's a common feature that made that counterattack work. I think, but in general, I think that is a good idea. You're right. You can't let them settle into, this too structured and not pushing it. And, but I think, trying to do it with constraints sometimes might be the way to go with that. Yeah.
And then perhaps I ought to, one of the things I've just been reflecting on as we've been talking is I perhaps need to think about maybe doing it in some different spaces. So, for example, slightly different numbers and different spaces, so that they get an understanding of, right, now what does this space look? How do we deal with this space when we've got less people, but a similar area, for example? What does that look like? And I could explore that. Yeah, I mean, because for me, that concept of invariance, it makes total sense to me in terms of like a kind of an individual movement pattern. Because, it makes total sense. But I was thinking about it from a team perspective, because you've obviously got individual action variance and invariance on the individuals in terms of the way they move and the way they perform, and there's certain actions that they do and the quality of those actions. But also you've got the variance and invariance of the way they interact. I mean, Mark O'Sullivan talks a lot about these football interactions, which is partly about the action choices, but it's partly about the action choices in relation to what others are doing. And those action choices are sometimes with the ball and sometimes not with the ball. And in this case, I'm looking at their action choices not with the ball to get them. And this is where, this kind of shared affordance idea becomes very powerful. It's something I'm really experimenting with, is this idea of, if I can explore a particular dimension of the game for long enough, using enough different stimuli, then they'll begin to sense the spacing, or sense how they need to engage in pairs, or in twos and threes, in ones, and whatever it might be. I'll begin to discover that a little bit, rather than what I would have done previously, and I probably see a lot of, which is to say, right, when the ball goes there, you do that, 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 and we'll get it, and it'll work pretty much every time. And the thing about that is, that does actually work.
Okay.
For a bit of time. Right? Until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, it's completely catastrophic. So it's brittle. It's fast. So the reason people do it is, you've got limited time as a coach. So I just go, right, you do that, and that. We'll rehearse it a load of times. Just complete rehearsal. Right, got it, sorted, brilliant. Everybody does it. It'll work a couple of times. And then an opponent will come along and they'll do something different, either as a group or as an individual. And the next thing you know, everybody's looking to the sideline. Well, that wasn't supposed to happen. That's not what we practiced.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. And I think that's part of going back to this, people not seeing how ecological dynamics is different. I'm finding this a real challenge. My research kind of has slowed down myself, because, you were right. This approach is for the long term. You're aiming for skill development that's going to be transferable, adaptable. You're aiming really long term, not this short term benefits. and also it's so individual. We expect people to learn at different rates, and to me, I'm finding it really challenging. I was not taught that way on how to do research, right? I was taught you put people in groups, you give this people block practice, you give these people random practice, calculate the mean for them and the mean for those guys. Well, they're different, yes, but that does not fit well with don't measure in different conditions and things like that. So to me, that is another important point. You're right. You're aiming for, and I like that phrasing. I think a lot of the solutions using the kind of traditional approach are quicker, but you're right, more brittle, right? They're gonna fall apart in other situations. You put the athlete in, definitely.
And that's one of, I think, our challenges in terms of conveying or articulating this approach to people is, firstly, that you're asking them, and if they're, constantly working in a scenario where they're pretty close to a kind of do or die competitive environment, it's a which I always think is funny when you're talking about like teen athletes, right? But a must win game, Yeah. But in some contexts, there's some schools over here where results really do make a difference. They're very important in terms of the way the reputation of the school and the reputation of the club and it's quite important, or at least is perceived to be anyway. And so I sort of understand how people in those environments, and that's their former life, as they talk about, isn't it? So in many ways I would sort of say, well, in your context, I guess you almost haven't got much of a choice but to kind of use pretty explicit instructional approaches, do quite a lot of kind of rote repetition to get a group to have some sort of organizational dynamics that will allow them to have some level of success. And you can kind of also see why coaches would feel almost a little bit neglectful not doing that, because it would the athletes are almost, I'm a bit lost, I feel we've got all these people coming at us and we don't know what we're doing and we're disorganized, you're really not doing the job for us, coach. So I can sort of see why they kind of want that. And this is why I use this term a lot, of like periodization of methodology. You can't just throw this in, right? It's got to suit the scenario you're in. But if you're in a learning, I'm in the luxury, yeah, we have matches, but these kids are on the journey with me. They have been for the last 5 years. So the matches are just a way for me to determine how effective the approaches we're using, whether any of it is transferring. It's kind of just a transferability experiment, on an ongoing basis to test. So I'm fortunate I'm in that scenario, and I don't wrap my entire being up in the results column of I'm fortunate in that respect. But so I kind of understand that but the big thing for me, I want to say, is one of the things that I find that and people don't quite get is you are articulating to them that this method and they'll go, it works. Look, it works in the session. Right here, right in front of my eyes. I can see it, right? And it's working in the game. I can see them acting in the way that we've talked about them acting. So tell me why I should abandon that. And what they won't do, and it's almost this kind of like, I don't know what kind of fallacy it is, but it is a fallacy. They won't attribute the breakdown of whatever they were working at as the actual method, the approach to getting them to do whatever you were trying them to do wasn't right. It was brittle. What they'll attribute it to is not enough application of what it was we were saying we would do. You didn't do it well enough, so we need more structure. And I know this because I did this for a long time. Right. Yeah. Whereas in this space, we're saying, right, we're going to work over a period of time, and what we're going to get to is something much more resilient. Much more, kind of embedded and strong, and I don't want to say robust, because robust is brittle sometimes, but very, it's going to give you that almost really fundamental connection between each other that's really powerful, but also super pliable and super adaptable. And if you get to that point, then you're kind of getting to that point of being a bit unbeatable, or at the very least, very, very difficult to beat. But it's going to take an awful lot longer to get there, and you might not see the results of it. Well, you don't even know when you might see the results of it, because that'll be determined by the group that you've got in front of you. So I can sort of understand it. So for some people, that must seem like a real leap of faith. And that's why I think a lot of them are asking, can't we do a bit of both?
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And that reminds me, it's more back to the individual level. But sometimes I think the traditional approach is that we see, novices show up with problems or flaws, right, in the way they move. And the goal of coaching instruction is to get rid of those.
Yeah.
Whereas I think in the ecological dynamics approach, we accept there's always going to be problems. There's always flaws. What you want to do is teach, they're going to be less frequent and probably smaller, but we want to teach them to be problem solvers, right? I got in this in a baseball example I recently, so in a baseball batter, when they swing, they use their front foot, they step and then they put it back down as kind of a timing mechanism. Someone posted a thing of a hitter they were doing that way too early. And so they're swinging too early and missing these slower pitches that were coming in. And the question was, how do we correct that? And my view was even the best hitters in the world are going to do that sometimes, right? They're going to step too early when they misjudge the pitch. Pitcher tricks them. You don't want to get rid of that problem. You want to teach the player how to solve it, right? So that when it comes back later on, it might be different and smaller, but you want to teach them. So I think that's kind of what you're talking about, right? We're getting, versus these short-term gains of versus developing adaptability and problem solving. Yeah.
That's a really great example, actually, isn't it, of how kind of embedded in kind of the coaching culture this conceptualization of error correction is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And going back to your point about invariance, I think about the world of golf, for example, and a lot of the world of golf is the whole industry is based on the idea of we see some form of invariance and we correct it. And that is deemed to be a successful golf, and they are called lessons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And golf instructors or golfers are often referred to as teachers or instructors.
Mm-hmm.
And it very much says that that's the role of the coach in that context is to correct error in order to reduce invariance and help an individual have more variance. The problem is they only have variance for a period of time.
Mm-hmm.
They have a decrease in invariance for a period of time. Because like you say, what they're not learning to do is learning to develop a movement that is perhaps more helpful to their goal, but physically learning to develop the movement as opposed to just being told how to get rid of one that's potentially destructive.
Yeah, I think another way to say, is that we're moving from the error correction as the coach's job to the error correction as the athlete's job.
Brilliant.
And maybe error is the wrong word too for us, but so the baseball example I've given, and I have a bunch of new data I'm going to show on this, is if you put people in the right environment, what will happen is when they do that stepping too early, players will learn to slightly delay the weight shift from the back to the front. So they'll have functional variability. They'll develop, if I make this error, in my movement, I can correct for it by something later in the same, movement. So they need to, I think that this kind of functional motor synergy, sometimes we call it, but yeah, so to me, I think that's a fundamental difference between what we're trying to accomplish. I'm trying to give the player much more, empowerment of doing these things than we want to. Yeah.
I've heard you refer to motor synergy before on some of your other podcasts, and I have to say it's something that intrigued me. Can you unpack it a bit for me? Because there's definitely some bits of that I'm not sure I quite get. It's one of those moments where I needed to write it down and I couldn't. So, as you're here, just unpack it a bit.
So the motor synergy is basically when you have one aspect of a movement, you could call it the degrees of freedom, or is compensating. They're compensating for each other. They're in kind of functionally working together. So the example I gave in the baseball one is lifting, putting your front foot down versus shifting your weight from your back to your front. There's no reason those have to be related at all. But what you see is if you let people practice, if one happens a bit too early, the other one starts happening a bit later, and they get these kind of this relationship where they're not complete. They start off being completely independent things, degrees of freedom that you can control. You could do them any way you wanted, but they become kind of structured in a way where they work synergistically. They compensate for each other. And there's lots of examples of this when, we carry something one hand, the force by one hand, they work together with the other hand. And so, yeah, this, to me, I've been on this kick about variability for a long time, but to me, I'm getting more and more believing that's what really becoming really skillful is, developing this functional variability, being able to adapt your movements to not only the changes in the environment, but also the inherent changes in you. You're not going to be able to move the same, the rugby example you gave, you're not going to start to throw exactly the same way, no matter how much you try. So you need to, my hands are going, wrists are slightly going a different angle. I need to adjust my elbows, or vice versa. So I'm really, I'm more and more I'm seeing some of my studies when I see training benefits in terms of results, I see this underlying development of functional variability. So yeah, so that's to me, that's a motor synergy, making two things that start off independent, coupled together. And it's not the same. So it's very different. Bernstein had this idea of freezing, right? To make a movement simple, let's move two things together the exact same way. So freezing is making a movement simple, but that's not very, it doesn't give you a lot of options, right? If you move things. Synergy is when you move them, they can move differently, but they compensate for each other. They're working as kind of a unit. So it's a way higher level of skill. Yeah.
So in practical terms, what you're saying is then a particular motor movement, like the step action in hitting, mm-hmm. appears to be the flaw, if you like. Mm-hmm. But it might not be the flaw. It could be that it's just that the other area of compensation isn't happening. Is that right?
Yeah,
or am I...
Exactly. Yeah. If your end result if it's going to be compensated. So one of the things we see and other people see, if you look at the variability in the different aspects of movement, like when you step, it goes down and down and down and down, right? So if you're going to have this compensation later on, there's no reason you have to be super precise about when you step, right? Mm-hmm. So there's, it can be an error if you're way off, but in a sense, there's no reason it has to be, the same every time if you're going to be adaptable. So,
and it's a little bit like,
I think we do. Yeah.
Sorry. It's a little bit like golf, where a lot of people place a lot of emphasis on the setup. Mm-hmm. And there's this concept of gasp, grip, aim, stance, and posture. Mm-hmm. And the setup being kind of, if you get the setup right, then that means that then the club will then move back in a more optimal pattern or plane, and so that's one theory, right? That has to be like that, and then the other bit is then that the backswing or the way the club goes back determines an awful lot about the way the club comes back towards the make contact with the ball. Mm-hmm. And the reality of that is that actually isn't true. And just go along the range of any main tour and see if any of those performers swing the club back the same as each other. You will see a wide array of variants, from the Bubba Watson, who is got the club over there, to the to the Furix and all this sort of stuff. But what you will see is quite a lot of commonality as the club arrives at impact.
Yes. Yeah.
And the sequencing of that, where it starts, how it starts, the sequencing will be quite different. So you will see differences in movement. And I've seen biomechanical studies which kind of reduce, like take 50 tour pros, put them through a 3D simulator, find the average of their movements, and then you've got almost like the optimal movement pattern on a golf swing. And I've actually seen 3D simulations of this. A guy called Ralph Mann did that, quite an interesting study. But all that does is to show us that actually, from a range of movement possibilities, really functional performance can be derived.
Yes. Yeah. No, I definitely. So yeah, you're right. There's the getting the club head square at the point of contact, the invariant property, right? That has to be there.
Yeah.
How it exactly gets there. So yeah, I think that, I think in a lot of history we've had in motor learning research, what's the same between skilled performers? Whereas I think we're starting to what's different? Yeah. How are they getting the same thing in different ways? I think, so yeah, I think that's a very important point. I think also, although really skilled golfers can reproduce the same swing with pretty low variability, I think, there's also going to be variability within their own each time they take the club back. And going back to what I was saying, it's almost like, I didn't quite take it back exactly right. Swing's over. Yeah. It's going to be, but that's not true. Like if you learn how to compensate for taking it back slightly differently, it doesn't mean that it has to be a bad swing. But we tend to look at, this flaw that we have to try to get rid of. But if you teach the player how to compensate, then it's not a flaw. Yeah.
Otherwise, every golfer would get to the top of the backswing and go, "Oh no, not quite right."
Yeah,
drop it. No.
But yeah, no, I think that's and then right. You have to take into account people's different body dimensions and all these things, so yeah, I think that's an interesting point too. Yeah.
It's fascinating though how often people will attribute flaws in either pre setup or pre-impact movements. I mean, in golf, the ball's stationary, right? So you're not having to even react to what a pitcher's doing and the different kind of disguises they're putting on the pitch, which you still have to engage with as well. But it's fascinating how people will put so much emphasis on that. Now, I know that there are probably certain areas, in fact, I know this for sure, there are certain places that you can place, you can, in terms of the way you set up, that will make it extremely difficult to get the club to where you want it to be able to perform the action you're looking to perform. Yeah. It will make it extremely difficult. So there's probably set up scenarios where the degree of invariance is just far too high. There's a bandwidth, isn't there? And if you're outside the bandwidth, then you're in trouble, and that's where injuries occur, all those sorts of things.
Yeah. And if you pull it back to, it's too much variability at the start. You're right. You can't. There's no way you can. My example: if you step that way too soon, there's no way you can keep your weight back long enough to keep. I think there's an interesting point there too. When do those things tend to happen under high pressure conditions and things, when probably that compensation mechanism, like part of the way that compensation occurs, you need to be able to detect that information. That the swing's offline and how I adapt. And I think, the pressure and things could probably mess with that mechanism as well. But you're right. There's only so much you can do. Like, the example I gave in the podcast, or otherwise we wouldn't call things by names. Like we wouldn't separate tasks, right? You can't walk to run, right? There's, right. There has to be some basic components to it, the invariance, or we wouldn't give it a special name of a separate skill. So, so I think, but you're right. There's and I think going back, this is another thing I see a lot of people talk about online is there any place for purely isolated technique?
Yes.
Drills, when you decouple everything and you have, I think I'm on the same page as you probably. I think whenever you can, you should avoid. It's better to learn in context and coupling. But I think if you have an athlete show up that they're so far away from the invariant, the coordination solution is so far away from these invariant properties, they're in my example in baseball, if the person's swinging without using their lower body at all, maybe that's the place where just focusing on because they're so far away from the core, the space you want them, that I don't know if anything, maybe getting them to hit off a tee or something that's really kind of an isolated skill, just to get them to push them to a different part of space. That's where I could see, but then quickly moving towards more of a coupled kind of drill, in my view. But
I think again, like you say, it depends. I guess it depends. It usually depends a lot. Depends on the how, like you say, how far away from the optimal, or how challenged they are by placing their emphasis. So to have a moving ball would just create too much. There's too much, because you don't really you'd almost be better off not really having a ball in context, rather than get them to hit the ball off a tee. You'd almost be better off not getting them to hit a ball at all, because actually what they're trying to do is to experience a movement, a different kind of a movement. And actually maybe having a ball would place a focus of attention elsewhere than where that needs to be, because the focus of attention still needs to be on how the bat swings, doesn't it? And you'd probably be working on exploring, what does it feel like if the bat's here? What does it feel like if the bat's here? What did you feel like if the bat's here? I mean, I still think there's probably scope to do that with a moving ball. It could be a bigger moving ball. You could hit a softball, for example.
And you could still, designing a task so that whatever the way they're doing it is not going to, if you can think of a way to do it, is not going to work. To kind of get them to find, I think sometimes we get, especially at lower levels, you get these kind of, in workspace, sometimes like there's a local optimal, local minimum, and you found this place that works fine right now, and for the level of challenge you're at and the skill, so you don't have much incentive to do that exploration part of the so you almost need to give them a task where if you can think of a way to do it so that it doesn't work. I know I've done this with I talked to I think it was Rick Shuttleworth one time. I was in England. I used to work with football quarterbacks that held the ball too low. I call it the Tim Tebow problem. They hold the ball too low, and it takes them a bit too long to get it up and out. In college, it's fine. They have time, but they get to the pros, and that's problematic. And I used to do all this different ways, and I think it was Rick who said, why don't you just put the defenders closer to them in practice, so that won't work anymore? He's like, it's easy. It just make the task constraint such that the existing solution is not optimal anymore, and it forces them to. I'm like, yeah, that's probably a rough way to learn, but it would eventually work. So. But yeah, so I do think, you maybe when you get this, these invariant properties you're way off. You have to do something.
That's such a Rick solution, isn't it?
yeah, that's his answer. Yeah, just put the people half the distance, the defensive linemen half the distance from them normally, or take away the offensive linemen so they have a free rush.
or again, the offensive linemen essentially only block for a limited period of time, and then they're gone.
But I think, in all seriousness, there is a lot of value to that, because it makes me ask, why doesn't this movement solution work? What's the situation it's not going to work in? And if I can't come up with that, then why am I trying to change it? But if I can, then that gives me idea for practice design. If it's a time thing, then change the time constraints.
I mean, the idea of isolated practice is something that comes up a lot, and I hear an awful lot of potentially soccer coaches saying, well, time in the garden and kicking the ball against the wall and getting the feel of the ball and moving the ball and all those sorts of things, that's absolutely valuable. You can't, it's not just about playing games, and they're 100% correct. There is absolute value in 1v0. And again, and I've spoken before about how 1v0 is, and I spoke with Ian on Ian Renshaw about this the other day, a few podcasts back, talking about how 1v0 is applicable within an ecological context. And I think that's a misunderstanding a lot of people have, is that there is a way of doing 1v0 ecologically.
Yes, you're right about taking away that's a good point.
And because if you're doing 1v0 to say, right, for example, you need to move this way, or you need to do this action. This is an action that's going to be valuable to you. then for me, that's not an ecological way to do 1v0. Mm-hmm. But if you do 1v0 in a way which says, what is it that you've discovered within this environment that you're finding difficult, or you're finding is an area that you would like to be able to either optimize, or, or what is it you're working on? And then I say, right, okay, so here's a way that you could explore that, or again, show me options. Find, right, what about, and then go, okay, what out of those, which is the one that you feel like might give you the best chance of achieving? Then, yeah, and they go, okay, yeah, so right, okay, so have a little play with that for a little while, just on your own in this kind of quiet space. Then maybe you want to come up against somebody else or against me and try it out. Now, do you feel better about it? Always trying again to sort of say, if you're having a bit of exploratory time in a 1v0, feel all right, feel like you got an idea of what that might be. Remember, I've got very little time with athletes because I've usually got 30, right? But yeah. So one of them is going to, the reality is they're all going to get something. I'm going to give them, or they're going to get a little reinforcement of some kind in every session. But I'm going to go in depth with 3 or 4 of them per week over the season, right? So I come out into my sort of technical space, if you want to call it that, skill space, and right, okay, what is it that you're looking at? What are the options? Right, explore that. Right, now come at me with it, or I'll come at you and you see how you react to me. Okay, now refinement. Okay, refinement. Yeah, right. Now let's go and apply. Not necessarily going to get it right, but let's go and apply. Right. Every time I see you try it, I'm going to give you a bonus.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. I think you're right. The 1v0. I think what the thing that is problematic for a lot of us in ecological approaches, 1v unrepresentative 1. Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Cones, flashing lights, a batting machine that's using the same speeds, right? I think that's more problematic, right? Because you're right. When you do 1v0, you're not learning, this is how I get around something. You're not learning the perceptual motor solutions. You're just learning the feel of the motor and maybe your proprioceptive information. But in these other things, you get in the danger of learning, these perceptual motor solutions, these strategies that are not going to transfer to when you get the real 1v1 or more than that. Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting for me though, because I love that. That's got to go on a t-shirt, Rob. 1v unrepresentative 1.
Gotta make a shirt of that.
But yeah, I mean, in many ways, 1v0, as I've just described, would be better than 1v unrepresentative 1.
Definitely, yeah, yeah. And I think, like you were saying about the baseball drill, that you're right. That what's the goal of 1v? What are you trying to achieve there when you're in the isolated? You're right. Getting the feel, getting the thing that you can plug in. You don't want to learn to use the information. Yeah. So, I think that's a good point.
I'll give you an example, actually, of 1v0 I've done in golf. Mm-hmm. Not me, my coach, Kendall McQuaid, friend of the podcast. I wanted to explore power. Mm-hmm. So I have a particular movement pattern that basically robs me of power. They call it, in baseball, you'll be very familiar with it, they call it casting. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of when you start the movement in a particular way that basically you lose a lot of the late hit, the lag, and so the power disappears. Yeah. Yeah. So I do this cast move. So he's talking about anyway. So traditionally it would have been right. Well, you got to move like this. So what he did was he said, right, I've got a new golf club for you, and he's got this whole bag of golf clubs, right? Mm-hmm. And he gives me this golf club, and it's a golf club with the head of the golf club's been taken off, and on the end is a golf ball.
Okay.
So it's super light, right? And it feels like nothing, right? And he says, right, you've got to hit the rubber tee, so there's no ball. I want you to just hit the rubber tee. Now, firstly, hitting the rubber tee with a golf club that's super light with a golf ball on the end of it is a phenomenally difficult task. I don't mind telling you. And it was very frustrating for some time. But anyway, and eventually I started to get it, right? And he said, can you feel the sensation? Can you feel the sensation of how that and placing my kind of focus of attention a little bit in how that ball was moving and how it was hitting the tee and the sound it was making and the noise it was making and the speed it was generating. So then he gives me my club back, right? And I get this 7-iron in my hand and it feels like it's got a brick on the end of it. I can't tell you the strangeness of the sensation of swinging this thing. But then he started to say, right, now you're feeling this super heavy thing, right? And can you feel where it is in space as you bring it down? Right, okay, so now and then he gave me, he's got one of those launch monitors that gives you speed. So you're getting a number, you're getting a readout, right? So I'm hitting it. And as I was trying to hit it, I'm seeing this number, and the number is not correlating with what I think I'm experiencing. And then I have this moment of revelation that where I get the high number is when it almost feels as if I'm leaving it behind me, which is such a strange sensation because it feels totally out of control. Because I've kind of learned a movement pattern where I want to be in control of the club. And being in control of the club does not give you speed. Yeah. So I went through this whole process and I never hit a golf ball.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a kind of a tried and that's a well-supported method. I would call that error augmentation.
Right? Error augmentation, okay.
Yeah. So we do that in baseball too with, you give someone a piece of PVC pipe to swing instead of a bat.
Yeah.
If they're doing anything like breaking their wrists too early, then it'll whip and you'll get this feel. You could totally, whereas a bat is not flexible enough, you're not going to feel it. So, I think that's part of it. There's more to it that he was doing, but he's making you get a different feel. And, I think that's a very I started to think about that too, what athletes feel, this holistic perception of the movement. And oftentimes in baseball, it's it'll be, if you look at it from an external reference point, it'll be totally wrong. They'll describe, I feel like I'm doing this, but they're not at all. Yeah. But if that's what gets you where you need to go, and I think that's an important concept we need to look at more. I think
that's one of the challenges I think we often face, isn't it? Is that the athlete perception is sort of a counter perception. They think they're doing something, but in reality they're not. And so helping them to discover that they're not, as opposed to just either showing or telling them.
So that's a good way to feel the other types of movement. Yeah, no, that's a good example. Yeah, definitely.
And for me, that's again fundamentally the difference of if you are to work isolated, you're working isolated from an entirely different conceptualization of what the isolated work is for. So most people's approach, I would say, is the reason they go isolated is because they want to simplify. They want to use. Oh, that was the other area, task simplification. So they wanted to simplify the task, reduce the difficulty level, reduce the amount of challenge in the environment, and so that they can purely attend to the repetitive movement that the coach wants to predefine. You must be able to move like this to be a effective sports person. Repeat the movement over and over with enough repetitions, and you will be able to then perform that movement. Now, fundamentally, there is just everything about that is the opposite of the way the ecological conception thinks. Yeah. If you're doing isolated work, it's still very goal directed. And if you're doing isolated work, it's not to just repeat a movement that's been pre-prescribed. It's to allow a performer to discover the movement possibilities and refine down to the ones that are going to become more optimal for them, given their physiology, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think, and it fits with the overall theme of, the role variability in practice, right? In 1v0 traditional way is low variability, that you need to learn this technique. Whereas again, I think we'd want lots of it. Why don't you try going behind your back, doing a crossover? That's the time to get the feel of these different ways to do it. So you're basically giving them a big, sometimes people use movement toolbox, right?
Yeah.
So that when you get into the post practice, you have all these things that you've experienced and possible things you could try. Again, not saying that this is the one that will work, but you've explored more. Yeah.
I think that the one big thing for me, I'm conscious of time and coming up on time, but the one thing for me about the variability side of things as well is And I think, and I've heard Andrew Wilson, I use this phrase a lot in my workshops now, by the way, Andrew. It's something Andrew Wilson said on one of our podcasts previously, the one we had when there was a group of us, is variability isn't noise, it's signal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what people perhaps have missed out on, is the idea was to rid yourself of unwanted variability, as opposed to actually say, right, let's utilize variability as a source of information that will enable us to perform certain actions. And people assume that the reduction of variability leads to consistency.
Yes.
You're looking at it the other way around. You're saying embracing variability and being able to adapt within, and there's always going to be variability, always. So being able to adjust and adapt within the bandwidth of variability that you have is the source to consistent performance.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Some of my training studies, people are improving while at the same time, they're doubling the variability in that, certain aspects of their movement. It's just this functional variability that's getting stronger, right? You're right. It is purposeful. It's part of the skill. It's the signal. It's part of the the aspect of movement you need to develop. I think definitely.
Just clarifying that, then, you say that in your studies, you see situations where athletes actually deviate from the perceived norm more, yet perform better.
In more from within their own skills. So if I look at like an athlete, some of the training studies I've done in baseball, if I look at like the timing of when they land on their front foot, if I look at the variability of that timing, it actually increases from pre to after the training. So this measurement of the movement is actually getting more variable and more noisy. And the traditional approach would be like, oh my God, that's wrong. They should be doing it the same every swing.
Yeah.
But it's what's getting stronger is the correlation between the timing of that and the timing of the weight shift is right. So depends on what numbers. It's part of, I think in the one episode I did when I looked at kind of the relationship between movement variability and outcome variability. I tried to, I think sometimes we've been looking at the wrong types of variability for a long time. Like, it depends. Well, I guess not the wrong types, but it's just you have to think about what you're actually measuring and what answer it gives you. I think definitely. So some of the measures of variability we see get higher within an individual after learning. Yeah.
But then, and so I assume that you said, so you might see, say, for example, foot movement becoming more variable, but it's got increased. What you're saying is, if I understand correctly, the synchronicity with the other movements becomes stronger. So it's like it's more synergistic.
Yes, exactly. So we can, if you do like a simple correlation between the timing of this and the timing of that, it gets higher. So if this one's a bit earlier, that one's a bit late, and vice versa. So they compensate. Part of that compensatory mechanism developing is becoming a bit more variable in your movement, right? You have to if you're going to allow for this thing to be a little late, then I have to be a little more variable in the next thing. I think so. So again, variability serves a function, definitely.
And going back to your point about outcome, all of this stuff can all work together, and you can still get struck out because it's not as simple as just let's do all these, But what you're doing is you're allowing an individual to begin to attend to the things that enable them to perform at their best, rather than the things that they thought would help them perform at their best, but in reality is actually causing more interference. In reality, the desire to try and do some sort of super mechanical, repeatable movement actually takes away from performance capability. Then the ability to adjust.
So. Yeah, I do believe so. There's no, everything we have, I see it's not a pre-programmed ballistic action in my baseball example. So yeah, if you develop that, I don't think it's going to give you the way that pitchers, the thing that's happening in baseball, without getting too deep into baseball for your audience, but is the pitches are starting to blur the types. So they used to be like, this is a fastball, this is a curveball, and now pitchers are starting, they have the tools now to measure the spin rate and all these movements of pitches, and they can change their grip. So they're starting to blur into each other.
Yeah.
So there's not, so hitters really need to be very adaptable to, they're going to get a 95 mile an hour fastball on one pitch and one that's 15 miles an hour slower. That's a very, very different movement you need. So, to be adjustable, and then another pitcher comes in that's different. So, yeah, so I think it's a key element of skill, definitely. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well, so much still to discuss, so much still to learn. You keep pumping it out. It's every week there's some source of insight that makes me realize how much more there is to learn, and so much more to experiment with. So keep doing it, because I'll keep trying my best and reporting back my field notes week to week.
Yeah.
So just quickly, I mean, like you said before we started recording, you're pretty busy in the baseball space, doing quite a lot of workshops and consulting work and various other things. And there's quite a lot of the interesting stuff in the baseball that I think is really transferable to any striking sport, to be honest. If people want to either get in touch or keep tabs or join your support your podcast on Patreon, which I highly recommend they do, because it's not easy to produce the content that you're putting out. I just get together with people who are brainy like you and ask them questions, but you actually do the work. So just how do they do any of those things?
Yeah, the easiest way is to just, if you go to perceptionaction.com, I've set up a website for the podcast that has, all the ways you can subscribe and contact me. And, I'm happy to, if you want to contact me on my work email, it's robgray@asu.edu. I'll get to questions eventually, but, and then on Twitter, you can follow me. On Twitter, I try to post a lot of links to articles I find on skill acquisition and motor learning. So if you're interested in keeping up with the literature, that's what I try to do on Twitter, along with posting links to the podcast and occasionally getting in arguments, but that's getting less and less. But so that if you're interested in that, I don't always read them all, so I can't endorse them, but I try to keep a look for all the new ones that come out. So
right.
So that's another thing people might want to do.
Well, brilliant. Well, I'm as usual, I'm really appreciative of your time, and thanks for. In some ways, it's almost been a little bit like a therapy session for me, Rob, to be honest, just to make sure that I wasn't going completely mad. So I appreciate your time for that, if no other reason.
Yeah, no, it helps me a lot too. I'm relatively new to a lot of this stuff too. And still learning and understanding, and I think it's a fairly new theoretical. People, that's another thing. People, it's been around forever. Not really. Ecological dynamics. No, in the time of scale of research and theory and science, it hasn't been around very long at all. So I think we're still all learning and figuring this out. So I think it helps to talk about it, definitely.
Brilliant stuff. Well, like I said, keep up the great work, and always appreciate what you put out. And I thank you for coming on board and sharing some ideas with me.
Oh, you're welcome, Stuart. Anytime.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.